gonna get rid of abortion. He did. I'm against this. He's against it. He said, look, now that I've told all these lies, I can stand up in the middle of the street and I can shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and nobody will care. And that's what we're getting right now. See, Trump is getting so rich, he's breaking all the laws, but nobody cares because they got abortion. Okay? And in my prior life, when I was a tax lawyer, I represented some mafia bosses. And I represented some, I didn't represent them, but I knew some drug dealer bosses. And they made their money off one thing. They get a police, they get a judge, everything they want. And then once they give what they want, they say, nah, shut up. And that's all Trump is doing. But I want to say this, related to that. What Frederick Douglass said was, let's be frank and honest about Lincoln. He was not for me. Now, my view on Lincoln is a little personal. My great-grandfather was a slave and fought in the Civil War. Lincoln was one of those, the South said, any other prisoner will keep as a prisoner of war, but the former slaves fighting us, we're going to kill them. And they had to make Lincoln, and he never really came on board, but they had to make him speak out against that. He was not going to do anything to protect. Okay, so, and the second thing is, Senator Henderson, who sponsored, introduced the 13th Amendment, was also the senator that introduced the bill to compensate the South. See, the one thing unique about the Civil War, I didn't realize, there were 5 states in the Union that owned slaves. Okay, Kentucky, Delaware, was Maryland one? Okay, Maryland, and I'm missing somebody. Here, there were 5. The Declaration of, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the Union-owned states. See, it's another example of Nixon. I said Nixon, you're a tricky dick, I guess that's what I'm thinking about with Nixon. Is that they played games with legislation, they played games with people's lives. So the Emancipation Proclamation would have applied to Shreveport because they were still in rebellion. So the slaves in Shreveport had said, you're free. Now, how you going to be free in the South and the Union not there? But it would not apply to New Orleans in the same state. Why? Because New Orleans had already surrendered. So he really wasn't trying, it wasn't his idea anyway. Senator Sumner and another senator, Representative Hayes, who's an abolitionist, was demanding that he issue the price. He didn't want to do it. And so in a letter that Henderson wrote, he said he was coming into his office and these abolitionists were leaving. Now Henderson was from Missouri, a slave owner state, and a former slave owner, and Lincoln confided in him, I don't trust those two firebrands. They're trying to make me do this amendment. It may be time, but I looked at it in the letter and I said he's more comfortable with the slave owner than he is with who? These two abolitionists. And so afterwards, Henderson introduces the bill to the slave owners in the Union that will pay you if you give up slavery. And the purpose was to tell the South, hey, they did it. If you guys do it, then the South may do it. So he was trying to come up with a negotiation to the South to say, stop fighting us, we'll compensate you, come back into the Union. And so I think that's what the accept clause became. It became the nugget because Lincoln felt like, and he sent a letter to France that said, look, this war will not have anything to do with slavery. If we win, slavery will remain. If we lose, slavery is going to remain. That's what he said. And so some felt like he put an incompetent general in to fight the war because he wanted the South to give in, to negotiate, because he felt that the country was built on compromise. When the founders built the country, they let the slave states in. So they didn't have a right to what? Stop it. So the last thing I want to put on is the deviousness with the 13th Amendment is that the South wanted a constitutional amendment to protect slavery. They never got it until the 13th Amendment. Because the 13th Amendment protects slavery if you're duly convicted. And so the South really got what they wanted. They just didn't get it the way people thought they did. And that's why this congressman I quoted first off said, look, the 13th Amendment did more to expand slavery than anything that had done before. Because it gave it legality, it shut up the abolitionists, and it made people say, well, the same thing people say now. If they had committed the crime, they wouldn't have to do the time. But what people don't think about is, why is it a crime? You know, why is it a crime? So I joke with people in Louisiana, I say, if a rural person put a big tire on their truck, monster tires, that's not a crime. But if somebody tints their windows, that's a crime. Now, one of the safety hazards, that big tire gonna lift up the fender, it's gonna hit me in the head, that other one got nothing to do with me. Does it have to do with the fact that most black young boys and women tint their tire windows? And most whites put on monster tires? Because that's one of the legacies I was trying to bring out, that things are the way they are. This is what Dr. Thompson at Dillard used to say. He said, things are the way they are because a mind sat down and said, I want to make it that way. And then once they sat down and said they want to make it that way, Professor Higginbotham, they came up with something called original intent. And though they said, since I've already made it that way, you can't change it tomorrow. In other words, you're stuck with my racist ways. And even though the country may change, you can't do anything about it. And the sad part about it is, that's the way most, when I say most, I mean most African Americans, educated, allow it to be. And some say we do that because we're living in a state of extortion. We know if we speak up, some bad is going to happen. Well, I didn't mean to get into that. I'll say that for Sunday when I'm a real doctor.
Well, our next question kind of focuses on what you just mentioned and highlighted in your opening statements around the intent of the 13th Amendment and the idea, are you all convinced that the 13th Amendment really provided a re-enslavement through the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's easy. Like you said, there's so many pieces about how it did exactly that. But I would say, again, I always emphasize the way in which the economy needs labor to be controlled at the time. We have to understand that economic shifts happen first, and then the social political superstructure responds to what happens as a result of the economic shifts. Think about it, the great migration from the south to the north didn't happen until the invention of the mechanical cotton picker, not the cotton gin, which intensified slave labor, but the mechanical cotton picker, which replaced slave labor in the South. Now slave labor was now black labor was needed in the North, in the industries, right? But during deindustrialization, right, what happened, right? It led to mass incarceration because a lot of folks were losing their job in so many different ways. And so when I think about the 13th Amendment, I think about how it was a strategic instrument of the control of black labor in particular, but labor in general, right? And how do I quell dissent, right? I don't know if they're gonna beat somebody with a steel-toed boot or a cane with a metal end right now. I don't know how things going. It might happen like that, and it still might be looked over. But nonetheless, right? We have to think about a way and a strategy to capture people that might dissent against capitalist production, right? And what does that look like? It looks like, okay, well, let's create laws, policies, and practice that disproportionately incarcerate people that look like black folks or that challenge my political agendas. And so I think it's another strategic tool, and and I think the language that you highlighted in particular, how that language, because in the 13th Amendment, as the precinct talked about, it had the accept clause, but we see prior to that it was unless, right? That's very strategic, and I thank you for adding that insight on, the contracts, right, the Constitution, it presupposes how it's gonna be interpreted. So I think that already understanding how strategic it is to create a system that is designed and institutionally legitimizes violence against bodies, black bodies, right? And during when black codes were running rampant, Jim Crow, after enslavement, after the 13th Amendment, you had the convict leasing system, right? So during the Reconstruction era, you have northern, even though the North and the South were in this big quarrel that led to the Civil War, you had northern industry folks that had vested interests in the South. The South had to be rebuilt. How do we do that? You just let our black folks go. W.B. Du Bois said the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line. What we gonna do with all these Negroes we just let from our plantations? Now they was it expanded welfare? Wealth Freedmen's Bureau and a lot of different strategies created some opportunities for black folks, but it was very strategic, right? Those things were designed to sustain a population of people that you needed in the production process. The South had to be rebuilt who was gonna do it, right? So if you didn't do it voluntarily, then we'll create laws like reckless eyeballing in the South. You looked at me crazy. You looked at a white woman. Sundown towns. If you were out past the sun with it, then you just let them be free. Free. I'm out, I ain't got a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, and now you talking about a sundown town? Well, where am I gonna go? To jail. So that we can come and place bids on leasing you out, so you can be back on the Jackson plantation that you just left from. That's where you're gonna go. But why? Because labor was needed, and when it wasn't, there was the great migration to the north, where people were going to there were a lot of people from the north are southern transplants. If you go back, grandma, great-grandma, great-great-grandma, they came from North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, one of them, right? So I say that to say, and to situate the context of the 13th Amendment as a policy, a practice, a law that is designed to control black labor, those things are still existing now. And now, much like what you said, and I thought it was very powerful, I had never heard anybody articulate it like this way before. When you said the criminal justice system has now become the new middle passage. I mean, first of all, that's very provocative, but it's so true. And it continues to echo in our communities, right? And so, yeah, that's my point.
Tell you this, I'm gonna sit in on Dr. Jackson's class. I can believe that, man. Sorry, I missed it. I agree with him 100%. Lawyers are picky about words, and so to answer specifically the question, I would say that the 13th Amendment exception clause allowed for labor exploitation, as Dr. Jackson has laid out. And whether it be convict leasing or encouraging the criminal justice system to incarcerate black people by, stop and frisk or whatever kind of practices, racial profiling, walking while black, whatever. And then to use that to exploit their labor. That's what has gone on since 1865. And so I wouldn't necessarily call it chattel slavery, because I gotta be picky with my language, but I would say it's labor exploitation to the same degree, or almost to the same degree, as occurred prior to 1865. The thing I really want to stress, though, to you, as a constitutional law professor, is not only, there are two aspects to the 13th that are important. The exception clause, but then, as Attorney Jones referenced, the intent of the framers of that amendment. Now, in my book, I talk about the Supreme Court's betrayal of Reconstruction. And so what I want you to also look at, aside from the exception clause, also in its interpretation, is to look at what the Supreme Court has said about badges and incidents of slavery. Because in the Slaughterhouse case, which is the first case to come before the Supreme Court interpreting the 13th and 14th Amendments, the majority in the Slaughterhouse case, and these were the conservatives, these weren't individuals who were considered radical Republicans. These were the opponents of equality provisions in the Republican platform. They said the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, but it also abolishes any badges and incidents thereof. Now here's the real betrayal. And the betrayal comes from the final arbiter of the Constitution, the Supreme Court. Because Lincoln and Congress, they can do a whole lot of things. But if the Supreme Court says the 13th Amendment abolished not only slavery, but any badge or incident thereof, and we know from the Dred Scott case, where the Supreme Court said blacks have no rights that the white man is bound to respect, we know then that badges and incidents of slavery is any discrimination that occurs against black people, period. That's it. And Congress can abolish, or the 13th Amendment abolishes any discrimination against black people. If the court had said that in 1873, maybe we'd be having a different discussion today. But they didn't. What they did was they narrowly construed badges and incidents of slavery. And I'm going to give you a quote from the 1875 civil rights cases, where the court strikes down the Civil Rights Act that said there should be no race discrimination in public accommodations. The majority says at some point in the stage of their elevation, they must cease to be the special favorite of the laws and simply become average citizens. And you know what they were talking about? They were talking about the 13th and 14th Amendments, saying that somehow blacks are the special favorite of the laws. That's the first discussion of affirmative action, and that occurs in 1875. So what should they have said? They should have said what the dissenter said. Justice John Harlan, the great dissenter, right? He said, there's no distinction here. He said, any race discrimination is prohibited by the 13th and 14th Amendments. And then he said, the 14th Amendment shouldn't just stop government discrimination, it should stop all discrimination, whether it's by an individual or by the government. So he had a very broad view of these Reconstruction Amendments. As Attorney Jones talked about intent, fascinating. Because original intent is used today, right, to stop any advancements in terms of equality, racial equality. But if you look at the original intent of the framers of the 13th and 14th Amendment, there's a whole lot of framers like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens who said, hey, these amendments are going to stop racial discrimination, period. These amendments are going to create racial equality, period. And so the Supreme Court betrayed us. They betrayed the principle of equality. They should have said, you know what? The radical Republicans, that's the intent we want to look at. And we'll have a broad view of what these Reconstruction amendments are all about, to create a society where the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all are created equally, becomes a reality. That's what they should have said. They betrayed us. And so I hope Attorney Jones will talk a little bit about that betrayal in his research as well.
I don't know whether Attorney Jones or Dr. Jones. Well, let me, I want to, one of the things I want to point out is what the research says is the drafters of this so important 13th Amendment didn't keep their notes. Nobody was raring to talk about it. And then after it was done, now Maryland already had this statute where it said I'm gonna sentence you. And it's like before, and Illinois had one. And so Maryland kept citizens and optioned it. And it came back to Congress. And at that point, Senator Turnbull, nor any other person who drafted the 13th Amendment talked about it. Intent, whether they was part of it or not, they went silent. So, and then when Senator Sumner and the others, and remember the House passed a bill to say, clarify, that's irrelevant. If they leave that alone, you can vote it now. So it was almost like they hoodwinked them. That's the term I want to use. So it was almost as if they stayed silent. They were having these high discussions. But Senator Turnbull, the language, he said, this is going to wipe out slavery in all forms forever. He didn't even talk about unless I sentence you. So I think just as an ethical matter, he at least should have brought that. Now, here's the part about Senator Turnbull that I think it was fascinating. Prior to going into the Senate, he was the #1 lawyer in Illinois to protect blacks from being considered a slave. Because one of the ways that Illinois got around it is that he's an indentured servant. So when Illinois said you can't be a slave, you can't have slavery, so he was the #1 lawyer that would protect. So what the whites would do, they'd bring the slave in and say, they didn't make him a slave, he's my indentured servant. And then they would go to the lawyer Turnbull, and he would go to court in several court cases where he sued to free the blacks. So I have he's like the original civil rights lawyer. He was like the #1 civil rights lawyer in the country. He drafted the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So then when I got into the research, I was like, oh no. And then I found out he was on the Supreme Court. And then I found out something else that you made me remember, that he proposed a bill to make a bust of Chief Justice Taney and put it in the Supreme Court after he wrote the Dred Scott decision. So that tells you where his heart is right there. He want to honor this man that has issues. Now another point I need to point out is, and go back to what you said, Dr. Jackson, is from the 1800s to 1865, there was 3 labor movements going on. Just to give you the background. We know the one about free the slaves. But there was a second one about free the slaves in the North. Wage slavery, they call it. White workers working with industrialists who were getting paid pennies. And then there was a third one that Lincoln came from. It's called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil, most of the founders and leaders in the Republican Party came from the Free Soil Party. And that was the party that said you can't have slavery in the North because it will undermine the wages of whites in the North. And that's what they meant by the Republican Party said in 1860, they're the party of the white man. And that's why they didn't want slavery in the North. For the same reason, Trump is about to run into problems now. He is sending out and running off all the illegal immigrants. And now the farmers are begging them, give us some money, because we're going to pick our crops. And so that's why it's so important, because Lincoln, as a labor policy, felt slavery was bad. And I don't know if you have it around here, but in Louisiana, and somebody says, I need to get my driveway fixed. You know the next thing out of their mouth? Need to find me a Mexican. Why? I want cheap labor. And so I want to get a roof fixed on a building. Contractor gave me a price. I came up with the money, and he called me back and said, well, I can't do it. He said, why? Because my workers won't come outside. Okay, and this is what Lincoln was saying, that if you let, and this is what the mulatto case was about, if you let these slaves, these blacks up here, they're going to work for cheap, and it's going to undermine the wages. Now, the key part to this that blew my mind is what Karl Marx has to do with this. This is around the same time that Karl Marx is in Germany. This is when Karl Marx is talking about capitalism. He's talking about the American capitalism that's based on slavery. And Karl Marx, the view that the anti-abolitionists had was the exact same view, and in fact came from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx's view was America is built on slavery. Slavery gave them cotton, and cotton gave them their standing in the world. So when Trump says, make America great again, I say, you gotta ask yourself, when was America at its greatest? And it was at its greatest with white supremacy, and white superiority was number one, and everybody else was free labor for them. Okay? And so that's why it's important to understand. So the next project is going to be the mechanics of enslavement. Exactly, how do you enslave somebody? And so when I read the first slave statute, I realized that they didn't go out and snatch people and enslave them. The people came in already enslaved. So there wasn't any race war, and then whites won, and then blacks got enslaved. No, that's not what happened here. The laws enslaved them, which meant whoever controlled the legislature enslaved them, and whoever controlled the vote enslaved them. And as a friend of mine reminded me last night that if you convict them of a felony, not only have you enslaved them, but you've also stripped them of the right to vote. And so when you look at the accept clause, it's more than just about what it appears to be. It's about returning the country to a point. Now remember now, originally, only white men who were property owners could vote. This is what everybody forgets about. You know, white women can vote. Blacks can vote. Indians can vote. White men that didn't own property can vote. So when we're talking about these statutes and these laws, we're really talking about white men and ladies. And they're the only ones that can vote. And they said, and my grandfather was a farmer, so and I did pick cotton. But I wouldn't pick for my grandfather and my uncle. And so I can tell you personally, owning land is about nothing unless you got labor. See, if you don't have labor, you just a broke landowner. and my grandfather had free labor, his grandchildren and his children. And we used to argue in the cotton field, and granddad, I think they fought a war about this. He said, war about what, boy? And I said, us out here picking this cotton, and you paying us these little wages. And granddad said, well, I tell you what, you don't have to pick my cotton. But you ain't sleeping in my house tonight. And you're not eating my food. And I ain't driving you back to town. So I can identify with the mindset that if you come over here and you got all this free land, you maybe got 1,000 acres, maybe got 10,000 acres. But all it is a tax liability unless you got free labor. And that's when somebody said, we need to get us some labor, and they instituted the slave trade. Then next, when the Civil War was over, they said, what? How are we going to rebuild? The North is broke from the war. The South is all bombed out. There's all this. So what did they say? Well, I got you some more free labor. And so what the message, I hope the young folks get out of this, is you can rap and you can dap and you can do all that as much as you want to. But you may wake up one day, what you think is never going to happen, you're a frog in hot water. It's already happened. Labor is free. Trump is saying, get rid of DWI, what do you call that DWI, but diversity? Yeah. Get rid of that. And in fact, and if you oppose us, I'm going to indict you. And if you oppose us, I'm going to do whatever I want. Why? And now they told the law firms, they told the top universities, either jump to my music or what I'm going to do. I'll take the money back. And I say, what the similarity in that is what W. Du Bois said. He said, poor whites have what's called, what do you call it? A psychological wage. And that wage is, I ain't black. And that's all Trump is giving to whites, and that's why they're happy with it. You know, look, the only people subject to ICE, let me switch that. The only people not subject to ICE are white folks. Everybody else is subject to ICE. And ICE can come and snatch you up. And you ask that guy from around, they can snatch you up. While you hollering about, I got this, I got that, you on a plane and ship that. And so as blacks sit around, and not just all blacks, but minorities sit around and say that didn't have anything to do with me. I just want you to remember that's the same thing the blacks in Massachusetts said when they passed that first slave statute. It started out, it didn't have anything to do with me. But it ended up, it had a whole lot.
We have about 8 minutes left, so one final question. Do we have any audience questions?
I'm a professor of child studies. Tons of questions, but I think one of my questions is super rich conversation, but particularly in how do we transition from the space of historical context to problem solving, solution finding. So what I'm finding in conversations about the work, and Dr. Jackson knows this, and my frustration is in that the devil is in the details, right? And so I teach a child policy course, and one of those conversations is what is the solution? Because if you don't put one there, someone will put one there for you. And that clause and that language and that reading and that detail and words have power and meaning, and you do have power. But how do we move from this? Okay, I can get you to understand what's happened, but how do we start moving toward plausible, practical, implementable solution as we move forward? I know it's a big question, but that's what I'm heard.
Professor, we're already working on that. Here's what the reality is. The accept clause is invalid legally. The first conversation that nobody talks about is duly. See, it doesn't say convicted. It says duly convicted. And there's been absolutely not any research on what duly convicted means. And as Professor Higginbotham can attest, the statute has to define its terms. And it doesn't define duly. So if it meant convicted, it'll just say convicted. So So Dooley comes from the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It's the first one to use it. And in Dooley, in that, it meant right to habeas corpus, right to a trial by jury, right to the jury of your peers. And, you know, for the longest, blacks couldn't even serve a jury. So it wasn't Dooley, it meant due process. And so there are a whole lot of questions about that. That's number one. Number two is, nobody in this country, since the enactment of the 13th Amendment, has been sentenced to slavery. And here's what I mean. What they contemplated and what Illinois did and what Maryland did is the legislature, the Constitution empowered the legislature to pass a bill, and one of the punishments was slavery. So prison labor as slavery had to be imposed by the judge. Now prison labor is imposed by the warden. And a couple of people, I think Michelle Godwin and others have written an article, well they call that, that's not Michelle, no, administrative enslavement, and they suggest it's illegal. Because what they contemplated in the discussion, they said, this can permit slavery. And the congressman said, the senator said, well, yeah, if the legislature sentenced them to slavery, yes. So they did not contemplate what we're talking about now with prison labor. And since one person put in prison, so the first thing is to say, invalidate that except clause, and at least invalidate the prison labor portion, because the judge has not sentenced anybody to slavery as the statute contemplates. It contemplates that part of the punishment will be slavery. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to get people to come to understand that this is slavery. Literally in the prison system. And we're sitting around watching slavery go on, even as we're upset that our ancestors were slaves. So we're sitting around watching it, being indifferent, saying they're not me. And I'll tell you, it's not you yet. And I'll end with this. I read some studies about the Holocaust. And one of the statements, I don't even know who said it, he said, when it came to the gypsies, I didn't speak up. They didn't get another group. When it came to them, I didn't speak up. He said, then when they came for me, there was nobody to speak up. And so I'm simply saying when my dad and my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, and what I learned from him, I didn't know I had inherited from him, was he got to be a slave. He got to be free after being a slave. He could have gone to Maryland, he could have gone to New York, but he went to New Orleans and enrolled and enlisted in the Union Army. And what he said was, my freedom is not enough. I'm willing to risk my life until all blacks are free. And that's what those blacks who joined the Union Army, who were former slaves. This is not Massachusetts 54th free blacks. I'm talking about the ones in the South. They were basically saying, I'm not going to sit around and enjoy my freedom while I know there are others that are still slaves. It's that spirit that we need to make a difference. Because you can assure me, those who've never been slaves or not subject to slaves don't have any reason to speak up. We're the only ones.
Yeah, I got a question. Pass the mic to me.
All right. One last question. One last question.
And number one, I just want to say I definitely appreciate you guys' conversation. I appreciate the discussion. Most importantly, I just appreciate the presentation. Now, you said that the only group of people not subject to ICE and this deportation is white people. Do you mind just expounding on that, please?
First and foremost, ICE is looking for illegal immigrants. And I don't know anybody walking around with a sign that says I'm an illegal immigrant. So they gotta figure out who do you think is an illegal immigrant? So who do you start out with? You start out with people of color. So people think they're starting out with Hispanics. Well, what does a Hispanic look like? That's for starters. Because most people are mixed. And if you go to New Orleans, as a friend of mine taught me, as the Pope just reminded us, with Creoles, you can't tell if they're black or white. So when you start out saying, I'm looking for an illegal immigrant, you gotta come up with an objective, and this is the problem they got all over the country. Who are you looking for? So they said, okay, we're going to places that we know Hispanics are in. Go to the farms, they with you. I told you, the one place they've never gone is hotels and the casino, and you can understand why. But so, when you start looking at the look, then people of color, you got people from, it may be from Haiti, so you could be subject to it, particularly if you speak broken English. Okay, you got people from South America, brown, but people are white. They're going to presume that what? That they're here okay, even if they're not. They're going to presume that. And in fact, I said, if you look at a dialect, you can start looking at Melania Trump. Okay, but she's not going to be presumed to be not from here. So that's why I say whites can walk around with no fear, because they're not going to be subject to it. It's just going to be people of color.
This will be our last question.
I have taught race and ethnic relations for several years, and as you started with a panel discussion, we start in terms of this particular subject matter with Lincoln as a great emancipator, and you have to counteract that, and I've always counteracted it in terms of the things he said, the things he wrote, the quotations about he, like any other man, believed in the natural inferiority of the black man to the white, that he was put in office to save the Union, and he would save the Union even if it meant freeing the slaves. But your discussion this morning deepened my understanding when you come from this legal point of view, and I never knew the connections between the state constitutions and the 13th Amendment. I guess that's my failing. So I thank you for that. And then when my colleague here, Dr. Gilchrist, asked her question, again, your answer points to the legal system being where it needs to be answered in terms of interpretation of duly, duly convicted and stuff like that. I wonder if then the conservative objection to critical race theory is because it originated in law schools and in the legal institutions. And so, but if we think of the law being the answer, an ultimate answer, then we still have to fear what we're seeing with the Supreme Court, which is the ultimate answer for the law. And historically, we can show, going back, as you said, to the earliest decisions after the Civil War, the Supreme Court has always answered politically. And, anyway, my question then is, how much confidence do you have in the legal approach to solving this question?
That was a good question. That was my last question.
That was a great question, actually. I'm gonna pass it over. I just wanted to say one thing that questions like that and examples that we have of the law being maintained by a high court of the land, being maintained in the hearts and the minds of individuals that are a part of bureaucratic operations, this apparatus, it continues to show that the ideology of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism that built this country and allowed it to thrive as a world power continues to echo, right, in our hearts and the minds, but also to maintain the system. So I always think about, there's so many of us that have been subject to exploitation and oppression, the wiles of the capitalist system, and I juxtapose in this moment right now, to answer this question, I juxtapose what happened during enslavement and what is happening now, more particularly, this debate on the control of labor, wage labor and slave labor led to the Civil War. And now in this moment, right, slave labor, Black folks were considered property. They were objects. That's why we talk about dehumanization. You had to be dehumanized in order to be used as objects for production. Well, now AI is changing the conditions of labor, right? Our relationship to capital is to be used to produce and maximize profit. Well, what happens when Black labor that was historically needed in great demand for capital to produce is not needed in the same way, right? Deindustrialization and outsourcing showed us that, hey, we gotta figure out a strategy to be able to incarcerate the crisis of people being unemployed, the crisis of not having people take to the streets like they did in the 60s, but to criminalize the poor. So we have mass incarceration to deal with that. We have cuts in social welfare because why do I need to provide welfare for a population of people that I don't need in the production process? No more cash vouchers. Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Act. No daddies in the home. How can I break up a community that I don't need as aggressively in the production process? Well, now you have technology transitioning from becoming labor enhancing to labor replacing our labor altogether. Yeah, it's impacting Black, white, Puerto Rican, Haitian, Jew, Gentile, everybody, all working class people. However, because of the legacy of white supremacy and how it's impacted the Black experience in particular, we are the first fired, last hired, right? And we are disproportionately impacted by shifts in the economy. So now you have AI becoming the new slaves. And now how are we going to construct a system that's based on, okay, at the point of production, the masses of people are being let go because they're not needed. Working class jobs, I don't know where y'all from, but on the first of the month, you would go to a grocery store and see everybody on the checkout aisle. Now you see 2 or 3 people and you got self-checkouts. You go to some restaurants, they don't even bring you a waiter. You just type in a little thing and they bring the food out what you want. You go to McDonald's and on 14th on Georgia, and they got a kiosk where you type in and they just cook it. I mean, we have not always had access to education that sets the context for upward growth and mobility. We already know that. Now there's further attacks on education, right? And so as we are being denied welfare, as we're being denied education, is at the same time we're losing our jobs and we're being criminalized. It's very strategic. So now, if this wage labor, slave labor was competing with wage labor, and now wage labor, human labor, is competing with robotic labor, well, what is this going to lead to? A civil war or a class war, right? I think that's what we have to ask ourselves. And I think that working class people, all working class people, Black, white, Puerto Rican, Haitian, we have to transition from a defensive posture to an offensive posture, right? Defensive posture, we've always been engaged in the fight for reforms. Reform, right? Someone that is woke, that is conscious of the ways in which we have been exploited and oppressed, who has developed a racial consciousness, understands that the fight for reform can only go but so far. I mean, didn't we fight for Roe v. Wade and affirmative action and all of the things? Well, what happened now? Right? So it gets to the point, see, people ain't gonna do nothing until they back us up against the law and they see no other options. Well, there's no other options now. So we have to transition from a reformative sort of struggle to, I would say, a more revolutionary, or arguably, there has to be a politicization of the working class, right? There has to be, there must be. We must use all of our power as a collective to fight for a new system that doesn't look like this one today, because it is arising. In the belly of capitalism, something is emerging. And fascism is designed to maintain the interests of white ruling class elites. So regardless if capitalists want to maintain the system or not, right? Our fight as working class people is not to bring the new system in and make sure, no. Something new is arriving, regardless if you want to fight or not. The fight is to ensure that what is arising is going to be reflective of our collective interest and not a new version of a more terrible system that we've already known, right? And so I would say the politicization of the working class, I'm thinking George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. I'm thinking a political group, a vanguard group. That's why I wore the shirt with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and on the back it said, all my role models were murdered by the government, right? Because it is time for revolutionary solutions and not reformative ones, but.
So the short answer to the question, I have very little confidence in the Supreme Court. I have very little confidence in Congress right now, and I have no confidence in the president. Now, that said, Frederick Douglass, when John Brown was arrested, Frederick Douglass, authorities went to his house. He was worried that they were going to discover some of the paperwork that John Brown had done in terms of figuring out what he was going to do, and that was done in Frederick Douglass's house. And so, fortunately, some of Frederick's friends got all the evidence out of there. And so, because he was thinking about going over to England, getting out of the country. I'm not there yet. I know a lot of people are. I'm not there yet. But what I would say is hold on. Hold on. See what happens in these midterm elections. If the Democrats take the House, there will be a check put on the president. No question about that. We have a system that's set up now. And people always ask me, what's wrong? What's wrong today? What's wrong today is that you have a president that's out of control, doesn't care, as Attorney Jones said, he only cares about himself. And you have a Congress that won't stop him. And under our setup, Congress is the power, but you gotta make sure that they have the votes. And so Congress won't check the president right now. They don't have a majority of votes to do that. And the Supreme Court is a problem because you have people like Clarence Thomas and others who won't do what they're supposed to do. And so you gotta have the House put a check on it. If people vote the right way, which I haven't given up confidence yet, I believe that a majority of the American people, and perhaps a clear majority of the American people, are going to do what's right in the midterm elections. And if they do, and the Democrats take the House, and amazingly, if they take the Senate as well, you're going to see a serious check put on this president, and then we'll see what We'll see what he does when he gets checked. We'll see if he tries to go shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, or whether he sits down and keeps his mouth shut. We're going to see. I doubt he will, but I want to be around to see that. And I really think that we may be in a position in 13 months to see just that.
I may be the naysayer.
That's why I gave you the last one.
I believe in the law. And the beauty about the law is, once you put the words down, we're all subject to it. So, I think the law, as it's set up, is the best, second best at least. Militarily, that's just not going to happen. Vote-wise, that's not going to happen. Getting the financial wherewithal to control the system. I had a conversation once with a cousin of mine, some of you may know, Jay Prince out of Houston. And we were sitting around, he and I, in Scarface, and he was talking about America. And I said, I got a question for you. I said, what's that? I said, are you aware? I saw a stat the other day that I think it's 5% of whites own more wealth than all of Black America. Let's just digest that. That few people own more wealth than 2,400 Blacks in America. 24 million. 44 million. I said, if you don't think I'm wrong, you go ask Bill Cosby what his billion did for him. You ask Kanye West what his billion did for him. And if she says the wrong thing, you can go ask her. I mean, I think they got 1 billion, nobody's got 2 billion, they say Elon got 107 billion. And let me tell you something about billionaires. I've said this for years, because when I work with them in New York. I said, you get 1 billionaire in the room, and he thinks he's God. You put 5 of them in the room, they know they're God. And that's what Trump is proving. All he's got to do is get those billionaires who think they're God, and when they all get in the room together, they sit around and say, hey, all this is subject to us. Then they're going to say and do what they want to do. But the challenge is, the law is the second best thing. And what's the best thing? It's faith in God. See, we got here, and I had a guy from Scotland when I was in law school who explained this to me. I didn't understand it. Then my mentor had said it, that I could see what he was saying. He said, when America was founded, they had no intentions of blacks being a part of it. It intended, blacks were the economic development policy. Slavery was an economic development policy. You know, they say mechanization and concrete over slavery. And they needed labor, so they went and got it. That's what we're here for. And then once they got free, like, what the hell are we going to do with them now? Because we shouldn't bring them over here to be citizens. And that's why I said the Lincoln's assassination, because he started talking about he had to give the slaves, the soldiers who fought in the Civil War, and the rule at the time was, if you were from Italy and you came to America and you were a white male and you had fought in the war, you didn't get citizenship. See, citizenship was first reserved for those who fought in the war, then it became landowners. So once the blacks joined the Union and saved the Union, fighting, they were automatically, according to the doctrine, entitled to citizenship. That's how blacks eventually got citizenship as a whole. Remember when the 15th Amendment was passed, white women couldn't even vote. All right, so that's a part of it. And so now what we're dealing with is, how do we address that? And we got to address that one way. Our ancestors came and made America hold true to its promise. And that's what Martin Luther King's speech was about. He was recognizing that you wrote a blank check. You didn't put my name on it, but I put my name on it. And guess what you're gonna do? You're gonna honor it. So the law can make you do that. But you gotta have faith in God, because the last thing I'm gonna say is what Dr. Thompson said to me, and I'm gonna leave it with you, I think I probably. He told me a story, he told it to me 10,000 times, Candace, about the Chinese Revolution. They were fighting, and one of the old guard came to the gate and said, open the gate. And outside the gate, he saw the biggest peasant that was fighting, beat the door. And he called him to the gate. He said, hey, you come here. So the peasant came, and the peasant tried to break in with all the rest of the peasants. He said, if I let you in, will you help me keep the others out? And I said, okay. He said, you don't get it. I said, I don't get it. Maybe you can tell me, I'm not that smart. He said, when we were doing the civil rights movement, we had one Achilles heel we couldn't resolve. Once all these blacks get in, who are they going to be loyal to? Are they going to be loyal to the cause? Yeah, if they continue to get in and they get that big promotion and they get loyal to the cause, they don't get fired. So the families going to move from the suburbs and move back to the ghetto. Or they're going to be loyal to the jobs. And one of the problems that Jay Meredith, that immigrated Ole Miss, said, that when he got recruited into Columbia, then Bill Warren, who was a partner in the firm I was with, told him that somebody said, there's no problem with opening up our law schools and our business schools to blacks, because they're just going to want to get rich, and they're going to cease to fight for their people. And that's our challenge today. Our best and our brightest are concerned with making money, even though more and more blacks are being enslaved and below the poverty level. And so when you say belief, and then the law can be a point, but it can only be a point if people are willing to use it and willing to fight for it and willing to be ostracized for fighting for it. But as long as all we're concerned with is making sure I can pay my mortgage and making sure that I don't get fired, then I don't want to say there's no hope. I want to say the hope is less. How about that?
I do want to once again thank Bowie State University, Dr. Adams, Dr. Parrish for allowing us to have this outstanding forum today. Let's give our panelists another round of applause. Thank you. And we'll be around if anybody else has any further questions. Thank you guys.